Starting with Israel's conquest of Canaan, through the period of the Judges, where the Israelites were oftentimes in combat with neighboring nations, and through the reigns of Saul, David, and other kings of Israel, warfare was a constant part of the Old Testament narrative. What of warfare in Old Testament times? Consider this quote from the World History Encyclopedia. No matter the culture or the time period, governments have routinely shown more interest and exerted more effort in warfare than in almost any other aspect of a nation's life. It is also true of the peoples of the Old Testament. They were warring peoples. So what are some of the important points about warfare in the Old Testament that helps us to understand Israelite history? Why did the nations of this time period wage war? Well, they did so for some of the same reasons why nations carry out warfare today. It is a struggle over resources, a conflict over commercial activity. It is a fight over pathways of travel, or maybe the biggest reason of all, it's out of pride as a people or because of the pride of certain leaders. When the Assyrians had mowed through Israel, and they had also taken control of most of the countryside of Judah and then threatening the city of Jerusalem, a military commander of the Assyrians issued a challenge to the people of Jerusalem. It's found in 2 Kings chapter 18, beginning in verse 28. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand." Much of the conquest in ancient times that took place was because one people believed and wanted to show that they were stronger, better, superior than the people that they were invading. Why did Israel in particular wage war? There were times they were engaged in a war for the same reasons previously cited for other nations. But there are some other things going on in Israel regarding warfare. It was God's will to bring judgment on the Canaanites, and thus he used Israel to invade that land and drive them out. This is reflected in something said about King Ahab, a very wicked king of Israel, in 1 Kings 21 verse 24. He acted very abominably in going after idols, as the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the people of Israel. We see here that warfare in the conquest was being used by God to punish the Canaanite people for their wickedness. God also gave the Israelites victory in battles so they would be secure as a nation in the land, because God was sustaining them as a people to eventually provide the Messiah. There were other times when God was using another nation, like the Babylonians, to invade and subdue Judah or Israel to bring them into judgment. For instance, Jeremiah writes in chapter 5, verse 15 and 16 regarding Babylon invading Judah, "Behold, I'm bringing against you a nation from afar, O house of Israel, declares the Lord. Their quiver is like an open tomb. They're all mighty warriors." It might offend our sensitivities that God would use such a brutal event, such as a war, as an instrument of his purposes. Consider it this way. Sometimes we are greatly disturbed and we long to see punishment inflicted upon someone who has committed an atrocious deed, like maybe harming an innocent child or an elderly person. Well, that instinct is not completely off the mark. It's understandable to want to see wickedness punished. Well, it's God who is the perfect judge. He is the most fit one to know when to execute judgment and how to do it and on whom. And through the Old Testament, we see that he uses war to carry out that very purpose. What about the weapons of warfare in the Old Testament period? Well, there were swords, that were used. These swords were of various lengths and shapes, including most likely a sword used in many conflicts, a sickle-type sword that had a curved blade. They used spears and shields. They used bows and arrows. And this was actually the personal weapon that was the most lethal. Sometimes they would dip the arrow into poison. Sometimes they would soak the tip of the arrow in oil and create a flaming arrow. Slings were also used, most notably the case of David slaying Goliath. But usually an army used slings when they didn't have the technology and the resources for bows and arrows. And then possibly the most intimidating and at times in certain situations most lethal kind of weapon would be a chariot pulled by a horse with 1 or 2 or 3 men in the chariot firing arrows. What about military tactics? Well, they're similar all through history. There's flanking the enemy, where you try to go around to one side and hit a weak spot. There is the feint, where you draw back and you try to pull an enemy out of a position and then you attack in a counter-assault. Then there are ambush attacks. You read about all of these, especially in the book of Joshua that depicts the invasion of Canaan, and in the book of Judges, where God raises up these leaders, and oftentimes they were military leaders, to throw off the yoke of some neighbor that was raiding them. And then there is siege warfare referenced in the Old Testament. There are a lot of walled cities in ancient times, and a siege is when a walled city is surrounded by an army, and the attacking army waits until the city surrenders, or they make a breach in the walls and penetrate into the city. And there were special weapons and tactics used to try to breach the walls of a city. It should be noted that the nature of warfare in the Old Testament was both brutal and personal. With the advent of machine technology over the last century, warfare has become impersonal and distant. It's because of the use of firearms that can fire rounds over a great distance, artillery pieces that can lob shells for miles, and airplanes that can fly over the enemy far below and drop bombs on them. This was not the case in the Old Testament. In many cases, it was hand-to-hand combat, which meant that it was brutal and personal. An example of this is King Saul's son Jonathan attacking the Philistines in 1 Samuel 14. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they, speaking of the Philistines, fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men, within it as it were half a furrow's length and an acre of land. Another way that Old Testament warfare is somewhat different than modern warfare is in regards to outcomes. It was very common for ancient armies to be after spoils, sometimes completely stripping and devastating a land, removing everything of value. Also, it's very common for ancient armies to capture people and then to turn them into slaves or sell them off as slaves. But something else happened very often in ancient warfare, including the Old Testament, and that is summary execution. That large numbers, and in some cases an entire population, would be put to death in the war. With any subject, it is important to understand that what is happening in the Old Testament is in preparation for the coming of the Messiah in the New Testament. The Christ would bring in the ultimate sacrificial offering. He would bring about a new covenant. He would also usher in a new kingdom. We see these references in the New Testament that link us to this change. For instance, in John 18, when Jesus is before the Roman governor Pilate, he answers in verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Speaking of this different kind of kingdom and different kind of warfare, the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4 to 6, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." And then the apostle writes to the Ephesians, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." When we read about warfare in the Old Testament, we should be looking for insights and lessons regarding our spiritual war as Christians. Because as intense as those examples of battles are in the Old Testament, it is true that our struggle against spiritual forces, well, it's of even greater consequences, and in some ways, even more challenging. But we should also remember that through Jesus Christ, we have victory. Speaking of our victory over our great enemy, death, Paul writes to the Corinthians in the 15th chapter of the first letter, "But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ."